So in our session today, we are going to firstly set the scene by exploring what Wesley's sermons are about and a little bit of scene setting there. Then going to very briefly give you an overview of the particular sermon that we're looking at today, which is entitled The Deceitfulness of the Heart. We'll then move into a conversation with the Reverend Dr. Naveen. And from there, we'll have some discussion, as I said, with either the big group and some small breakout groups as well, which will lead us in towards the end of the session to a prayer to round off this session together. So firstly, to set the scene a little bit about John Wesley's sermons. Since I'm a staff member at Wesley House in Cambridge, it's probably no surprise to you that I spend some of my time thinking about the person whose name our college bears, John Wesley. I'm not assuming that you all know who John Wesley was. So for those who don't, John Wesley was an 18th century Anglican priest who got caught up in and became a leader of the evangelical revival of the 18th century. He was there alongside other well-known figures such as George Whitefield. And he became leader of a particular movement within that revival, which would eventually break off from the Church of England and grow and take root all around the world in multiple different expressions. This is what we know in the UK as the Methodist Church, and in many other parts of the world there are Methodist churches or churches which trace their origin back to the Wesleyan movement. Wesley's own story of faith begins in the home. He grew up in his father's rectory and was taught very much by his mother, Susanna. He trained for Anglican orders at Oxford and shortly after becoming a priest would spend some influential months in Georgia in North America, which at the time was a newly founded colony. Those were influential months for Wesley, not because of how successful they were, but rather the opposite, because of, in a sense, how Wesley thought they had been disastrous. That in itself prompted Wesley to reassess his own life and faith. And on his return to England, he would have an experience which has become known as Wesley's Aldersgate experience, or a heartwarming experience, named such because it happened in a meeting that Wesley was attending on May the 24th, 1738, at a meeting house in Aldersgate Street. Wesley's ministry took an unorthodox turn as he was persuaded by George Whitefield to embark upon field preaching. And this led for Wesley to some phenomenal journeys throughout his life as he travelled the length and breadth of these islands, sharing his heart-warmed faith with crowds. It wasn't just, though, this field preaching for which Wesley became known, because part of the genius of Wesley's movement was, among other things, his organisational ability. That's precisely one of the reasons why methodical gave rise to the name Methodist. He didn't just leave vast swathes of disciples of Jesus, but rather organised these people who were now disciples of Jesus into little groups, which he called bands and then classes. These would meet weekly and are a forerunner of today's small group movements. Other elements of Wesley's movement, of course, were his brothers' hymns, which were a novel innovation in worship at the time. One of the important things to note about Wesley is that he took advantage of the technology of his day. I'm pretty sure he would be using Zoom if he were around today. In his day, the new technology was the ability at very affordable prices to mass produce pamphlets and books. And Wesley took advantage of this to publish selections of his journal, to publish sermons and other works that he's written. And this is one of the reasons why we have sermons which we still look to today as sources of doctrinal standard for the Methodist Church. So why did Wesley do all of these things? Why did he take advantage of these new innovations in order to, if you like, reach the masses through this mass media? Well, simply put, we might say that he was utterly devoted to God and committed to a gospel vision of enriching the world by promoting the kingdom of Jesus. But if we were to dig just a little bit deeper into this, I want to suggest that Wesley saw himself and his movement as what we might call a catechetical movement. Now, the word catechetical is a long word, and it's a word we don't use very often. It comes from another word, catechesis, which is an ancient practice of the church from the very earliest centuries, where the church grouped its new disciples into small groups who would be instructed in the faith. And catechesis is instruction in the Christian faith. Indeed, when Wesley was thinking about his movement and reflecting back on it, he made the comparison between the kinds of small groups and teaching environments that he had created for the Methodist Church and that catechetical movement in the early church. I think this is really important for us to bear in mind when we think about the sermons of John Wesley and how they might be useful for us today. When Wesley published his sermons, they weren't just there to be enjoyed and listened to. He published them explicitly in order that they might be used to teach and instruct those who belong to his movement in the essentials of Christian faith. Indeed, some of these sermons of John Wesley would be collected together and become the doctrinal standards of the Methodist Church in Great Britain and other Methodist churches around the world. Now, I could say a lot more, but that's for another time. I just want to make a couple of observations in summary at the beginning here. Firstly, catechesis is about asking questions about our faith. One of the things you'll notice about the sermon today and the sermons we look at this week is that in those sermons, Wesley is not afraid to push us to ask deep questions about our own faith. Wesley is never content to leave things at face value. He wants to peel back through what we might normally assume about ourselves, about God, about the Christian faith, and peel beyond that into a deeper understanding and a deeper experience. So there will be questions which Wesley asks in the sermon, and these are questions which I think are still relevant for us to ask today. Secondly, catechesis introduces us to something of the purpose of Wesley's work, which is not head knowledge alone, but heart knowledge, a deepening awareness of God in our lives and a deepening relationship with God. It's not for nothing that Wesley's vision of Christianity is often styled heart religion, and you hear that reflected in the title of these sessions, the heart of the gospel. In his day, when rational knowledge was being held in quite high regard, and as a very learned man himself, at the heart of Wesley's way was an experience. So that gives you some overview of Wesley's sermons and how we're going to approach them in this series. We're looking at them as ways of instructing us in our faith and leading us not just into deeper intellectual knowledge, but deeper heart knowledge as well. So, having looked at Wesley's sermons in general, let me just say a few words about this sermon, The Deceitfulness of the Heart, and then after that I'll introduce the Reverend Dr. Naveen. This sermon was published in April 1790 when Wesley was an old man. This is just 1 year before Wesley died. He's 86 years old. So this is he's not retired at this stage. Wesley is still very much active, preaching, travelling, organising, even out on the streets collecting for the poor in London. This then is Wesley's mature reflection based on a lifetime of observation and experience about the human heart. So he bases his sermon on Jeremiah 17, verse 9. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? The sections of the sermon are as follows. There's an introductory section where Wesley notes the prevailing views of a number of influential public figures of the day, people who are saying that folk in general are wise, virtuous, and happy, and therefore have no need for Jesus to be what classic Christianity has called the mediator, the one who mediates between God and us. Wesley, in contrast to these popular views, sets out his basic point, which is that when we look to this biblical text of Jeremiah 17, verse 9, we hear a very different position. Not optimism about human nature as wise, virtuous, and happy, but rather a realistic appraisal from God's point of view. Wesley then fleshes out this point of view in some following sections. The second section explores what it means that Jeremiah says the heart is desperately wicked. And then the next section looks at what it means that Jeremiah says that the heart is deceitful above all things. In the section about the heart being wicked, Wesley outlines the options that other people take, namely people who say that it's not the human heart that's wicked, but rather the devil who's wicked, who makes us sin. Or even for some people that God is wicked because God doesn't stop us from sinning. The text of Jeremiah and Wesley, in reiterating that, are very clear though. These considerations of other things being wicked but not ourselves take us away from the basic truth that it is our hearts that are wicked. Then he moves on into this section exploring what it means to say that the heart is deceitful. And Wesley argues that part of our problem is that we are very often not willing to know our own hearts, that we don't want to know our own wickedness. And therefore, it's not within our own grasp to understand how much we depart from God's intentions for us. And this leads us overall in the sermon to the catechetical question, that question about instruction that leads us into deeper heart religion, which is the question of Jeremiah himself. Who can know the human heart? And the answer which Wesley gives is that only God can know the human heart, because it's only from the perspective of grace that we can really see sin, and it's only from the perspective of God's wisdom that we can really see how foolish we are. Naveen, thank you so much for being part of this conversation with us today. I'd like you to just say a few things about what strikes you most about John Wesley's sermon, The Deceitfulness of the Human Heart.
John Wesley preached this sermon on 1st April 1790, just 1 year before his passing away from this earth, on the text Jeremiah 17:9, the deceitfulness of the human heart. He began his sermon by referring to the eminent heathen testimonies of about a golden age, when men were considered virtuous, when the dignity of man's nature was upheld as being wise, virtuous, and happy. During that time, the Bible was considered just a fine book, as far as it did not talk about a mediation, which they thought it was not needed. The mediator between man and God was not needed. Men were capable to deal directly with God if there was a need for it. So after charting out the background or the rationale for his sermon, Wesley goes into the sermon with the first point: the heart of man is wicked. He's not looking at the individual sins as such, because he's calling them as leaves and fruits. He's going straight away to the roots, and he's saying that the root of wickedness is the heart, and which Lucifer has planted, this root in man's heart. This is what he says. God made man sensible and rational, but it was the devil that originated evil in the man's heart. I'm sorry for using this word man, because Wesley was using it, and so it's not very inclusive term, but please pardon me for doing that. God made human beings sensible and rational, but it was the devil that originated evil in the man's heart. But why we could not realize it? Simply because the heart of man was deceitful also. So there was a wickedness and there was a deceitfulness. This is what the sermon is talking about in the main 2 points: neighbor and self. As Paul says that no one is righteous, none. Did it mean that there was no exception? All were sinful? John Wesley in his sermon says no. There are those who are born of God, inbred Christians. So there were men with a new heart, uh, for whom who have received God's mercy. The old things have passed away and all have become new. This is what he quotes. There were men with for whom they have a new heart, and they were just first justified but not wholly purified. But the problem with John Wesley faces is that he says uh, people are concealing it, that they are not fully sanctified. Even the pride of man is deceitful. In conclusion, Wesley suggests some applications in his sermon. He says, towards the end, he says, do not trust in your own heart. Do not be wise in your own eyes. And if you think you stand firm, take heed lest you fall. Finally, Wesley ends his sermon with a prayer and says, search me, O God, for any wickedness. Let me not deceive myself. Let me think soberly as per the measure of faith given to me. And so this is the nutshell of the sermon which Wesley preached on that time. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to pick up one thing that you said there. You mentioned about the relationship between wickedness on one hand and deceitfulness on the other. Could you just say a little bit more about wickedness and deceitfulness?
Yeah. Wesley is still sticking to his basic scheme of justification and sanctification. And he says, yes, people are justified right at the moment, but the walk of sanctification goes on and on. And during that walk, evil is defeated, but not rooted out. But people who are on that walk of sanctification still try to conceal it, hide it. And maybe because he has had a long experience of dealing with the people in his own movement who were doing that. So Wesley was a little worried about that also. He's a wise Wesley, old Wesley, not so much younger one and more enthusiastic and trusting that everybody is good because he is good. So he has come to realize that there is a concealment also, deceitfulness also, where the hiding of the things goes on. So I think that is where he is talking about that.
That seems like a really important thing, really, that we have got this deceitfulness side to deal with, as well as the wickedness, the sinfulness that is there to be rooted out as well.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Naveen, these sermons of Wesley, when they were printed, they were intended to help school Christians in their faith. So what do you think that Wesley wanted us to learn from this sermon?
Wesley was preaching for his time, particularly for his sermon on 1st April 1790. This time or this context of Wesley is called as the age of reason. And it brought few challenges before the preacher like Wesley. Firstly, what he wanted to school or teach to his people was that at this age of Renaissance, age of logic, a time when every religious, spiritual vision, inspirations were looked down upon with suspicion and doubt, when religious claims were asked to be evaluated, tested on logic and reason, when John Locke says reason must be our last judge and guide, when the mood was very upbeat and optimistic, man is the maker of his own destiny. At this time, Wesley wants to remind them the biblical fact that the heart of man is deceitful and wicked. So in that sense, he brings out this sermon for his people uh, to counter that. Too much of optimism in human-centric theology, human-centric faith affirmation that man is the maker of his own destiny, which later on we know that led our world history into 2 world wars because of too much emphasis on man, that human can do anything they want to do. Second thing which I think that Wesley is trying to teach to his people is the understanding of sin, how to look at sin, because in this sermon he is constantly quoting some people who are denying the sin concept, who are saying there's an absence of sin. There is nothing like sin in this world. If at all there is sin or something called sin, humans are not responsible for it. If humans feel wrong about anything which they cannot help, it cannot be considered as sin against them, that they have committed something. It is, if it is considered sin, then blame should be given to the one who made man, who made human being. Devil makes man do sin. So, and finally, God forces us to think, speak, and act something which is sin. So, beside human, there are several other things responsible for human sinfulness, like devil, Lucifer, tree in the Garden of Eden, first parents who ate the fruit. Most of all, if human commits sin, God is responsible who created human. So, Wesley wanted to, teach his people that we cannot deny discussion or consideration of sin. What is sin? And even now also, if you look at several people and their preaching, our community preachers, then they do not like to talk about sin. They do not like to preach about sin. Sin is almost absent from our preaching. So this is a very crucial thing which Wesley is trying to bring into the spiritual formation, the walk of sanctification, that understanding of sin and the root of that. Third thing which Wesley is trying to bring out in this sermon is, which I find a little strange. Wesley is naming some names in his sermon. He is referring to some people of prominence to make his point of what he is talking about. These names may be familiar to his audience or listeners, to his people. They may be secular politicians, philosophers, thinkers, or religious leaders of its time. Some of these names are Sir Robert, Lord Chesterfield, Dr. David Hume, Sir John Davies. Even there is a reference to a lady, and he's referring to them as a common examples which the people know, and he's making a point that what they are saying, what they are trying to impress upon, is not correct. So just be aware of that. And then finally, the Wesley's proposal comes in the sermon is that those who are born of God, referring to the second birth or new birth or baptism, are free from this wickedness and deceitfulness. Humans are justified by grace, but not wholly purified. In whom sin is overcome, but not rooted out. In whom sin is conquered, but not destroyed. So human must continue to watch and pray, and do not conceal or wear mask, even if when you are on the walk of sanctification. Wait for the revelation from God. This is exactly contrary to the teaching of that time, that there is nothing like revelation. There is nothing like inspiration. He says human must wait on God's revelation and not on human knowledge. So God's revelation or human knowledge, Wesley makes a very clear distinction and says we must learn to wait on God's revelation. So till the end, Wesley was holding on to his this thing, justification by grace alone. And so I think these are some of the things which he wanted to teach to his people.
Thank you. Those are really helpful points to draw out. And I think you're absolutely right that understanding the nature of sin and how we interact with our culture and society, which either doesn't want to talk about sin or wants to define it in other ways, is a really important part of instruction for Christians that we so often overlook today.
Right, right.
So if you were re-preaching Wesley's sermon, what do you think you would want to express differently today, or that might speak to your context or our context as a global society?
Society, yeah. Uh, the first thing which I see in Wesley in this particular sermon is that Wesley is basically dealing with the relationship between God and human being. When a human tries to become equal or make themselves equal to God by eating the fruit of the knowledge in the Garden of Eden or by building the Tower of Babel, that is where the sin comes in. That is where the sin is. Whereas if the human understand their relationship with God as between creator and creature, marked with God's mercy and human indebtedness, gratitude and love, obedience to God, then it is a blessed state of righteousness working towards sanctification. So Wesley is trying to say this thing. How do we relate ourselves with God? Are we trying to make ourselves equal to God by our own technology, by our own age-defying technology, scientific help, or we are willing to accept the lordship of God, or make ourselves Lord equal to God? So that is something which I find Wesley is trying to do, and if I have to do, I would be going more with the more examples of our time where human beings themselves have become God for the world, to decide for the world, for their own family, trying to rule their own small corners, their own small institutions, churches as God, trying to plan for that, trying to rule over it, trying to decide things without keeping God in the picture, without letting God be God. So we must allow God to be God of our world, whether it is Corona situation or any other situation. Let God be God. We cannot make ourselves God, equal to God, and that is where the sin is. So that is something which I would like to do it that way. Second thing which I find in this sermon, which is important, is Wesleyan anthropology is related with the wickedness and deceitful of human heart. It is not based on the individual acts. It is based on the heart, which is the root. And Wesley is not attributing wickedness to any nation. He's not saying even the Muslim nations or heathen nations or so-called Christian nations or Protestant or Catholic nations. Wesley is not attributing that any culture is sinful, or like Islam is sinful, or Muslims are sinful, or from India. Wesley is not saying that particular caste, Dalits are Christian, are sinful, or high caste are okay, class or religion. So Wesley is presenting an equalizer. Wickedness of all human. It is common, it cuts across all religion, all society, all people. And this is something which I find very touching for Indian situation, that we have a caste system in India where high caste people think, they claim in Sanskrit, they say, Aham Brahmasmi. That means I am God. I am the same as God. And this sin and righteousness does not apply to me because I am high caste. I am the Brahmin caste. I'm the top class. So, but whereas the Wesley sermon comes to us and says, all human beings are wicked. And this includes the high caste Hindu also. Because sin or uncleanliness is attributed to low caste people, Dalit people in India. And Wesley is saying all are sinful. So from that point of view, this makes something very helpful.
And that was a classic move of Wesley to focus in on the human heart and on the need for a personal understanding of uh, our situation before God and our need for a new relationship with God, which wasn't based on our achievements or our accomplishments, but based on who we are as we stand before God.
Right. That's true. And the Wesley's system is also working from inside out. It starts with individual justification, and then it goes out into the walk of sanctification and into the social holiness. So the holiness of individual heart, it begins from there. So inside out, the process begins, and then it leads us into our society, our nations, our United Nations, our world, global, and that is where this scheme starts working. So that is very powerful. I find in the Wesley's sermon.
Now, Naveen, you used a word there which I'm thinking some of the people listening might not be familiar with, which is the word anthropology. And just in terms of how we use that word in Christian theology, do you want to say a little bit about what Christian anthropology is, and when you use that word to refer to what Wesley is doing in this sermon, just what you meant by that? I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, by the word Wesleyan anthropology, when I said that, what is the view of a human being in the whole articulation of Wesley? When Wesley is looking at human beings, how he's looking at them, what does he mean by them, and where does he put a human being? And so that his understanding or his reflection, his articulation, his appropriation of human nature, the basic human nature, that I understand as a anthropology, what he's talking about, and not in the sense of like tribes or clans or no communities, and I mean anthropology in a very very wider sense, but it is more of the condition of a man, if I may use that word, condition of a human being, and how in relation to God, in relation to God.
Thank you. And it seems to me that that's the burden of this sermon, which is Wesley setting out for those who will read and listen to the sermon the anthropology that enables us to make sense of our lives before God. And going back to those two things that you mentioned at the beginning, that we are caught in both wickedness on the one hand, but also deceitfulness on the other hand. These are really basic understandings of our anthropology in terms of how we stand before God, apart from the grace that God gives to us.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Now, Naveen, I know that one of the themes of your work in general is decolonizing theology and decolonizing our understanding of the Bible. And I just want to give you an opportunity to reflect on whether there's anything from this sermon that feeds into that work of decolonization. And perhaps you might want to say a little bit about what that means for you.
At this time of, I mean, two things have happened. One is the corona virus, COVID-19, which is happening across the world. And those people who were powerful empires are also looking so vulnerable and so helpless. And the second thing is this sermon that has come at this moment, Wesley's sermon, where he is cutting across all nationalities, all power structures, and people with wealth and everything. So that brings a very strong point of view of decolonizing, that now that colonial approach, or that colonial thing is breaking down. And now we are standing naked as we are. I mean, without any of those social, political, geopolitical, or those relationships of colonized and colonial powers. And so coronavirus has brought us to that reality, that America is the one who is suffering, and the British Prime Minister is in the hospital. And I mean, what more we can think about. So it's like something which has brought us down to our basic humanity, that we all are sane, we all are creatures of God, equal and loving for each other, praying for each other, supporting each other in this situation like what is happening. And so nothing else is going to work. The only thing is going to work is that we all human hold hand with each other and stand together in the presence of God and pray that God, please save our planet, save the humanity, the global humanity from this thing which is threatening the life in general. And so this is where we all have become again equalized. No, we all have become sane. We all have become equal with each other, vulnerable, susceptible, and facing the same predicament, irrespective of our riches or power or what all. So this sermon is very crucial at this time, and to face COVID-19 and also stand firm in our faith, in our hope, and in our love for each other as human beings.
Mm. It strikes me very often how Wesley ends many of his sermons with an appeal to his listeners and to his readers to pray. And I note that this sermon is no different, because at the very end of the sermon, in the very last paragraph, he essentially instructs those who are reading or listening to the sermon to cry out to God, "Search me, O Lord, and prove me, try out my reins and my heart." Obviously quoting words from the psalm there. But I think that's such a classic move of Wesley, that it pushes, his sermon pushes us into prayer and into crying out to God. And it seems that that's a response to the kind of anthropology we've been talking about.
Right. That's right. That's right. I mean, the thing what Wesley is saying is that let me be sober in my stand before lest I fall. No, as a measure of the faith. So it's very very humbling, and in the penitence we stand before God and say, God, we are just dust, and you are the one who has breathed into our nostril the breath of life. And the moment you take away that breath of life, we go back to the dust. So it is that going back to that stage again. So.
Yeah. And it strikes me that always for Wesley, the way out of our predicament is not something that we do, but it's something that God does for us, God does to us, God does in us as we cry out to God and cast ourselves upon God. It's always a divine initiative that brings us out of our predicament.
Exactly. Very true.
Holding sin and our understanding of the deceitfulness of the human heart within the context of prayer, of confession and forgiveness is actually precisely where Wesley ends this sermon. And I think that's the point we're making about this being connected logically for Wesley to grace rather than punishment. It is where Wesley ends in the last paragraphs, where he essentially segues from preaching to prayer and says that all we can do is stand before God and ask for God to create in us a new heart.
Yeah.
And I think that's, again, there's something there about the Wesleyan way, which is unafraid to speak about some of those funds of ungodliness in Wesley's words. We might not use those terms, but we're unafraid to talk about that because we talk about it in the context of prayer for God's renewal and expectation of God's renewal. So I think that's been a really helpful way actually of bringing us to land. And also just giving us a little foretaste that while we've begun this series on this sermon on the deceitfulness of the human heart, we cannot end there, because this is neither really the last nor the best word that Wesley has to say. We move tomorrow to look at justification by faith. And we have the president of the World Methodist Council, J.C. Park, in conversation with us tomorrow. And then we move on Thursday to look at new birth with the Reverend Dr. Mary Kanotti from Kenya in conversation with us on Thursday. And I think as we hold the whole of those sermons in view, we see something of the Wesleyan logic, which isn't afraid to talk about the deceitfulness of the heart, but doesn't ever want to make that the best or last word that we say. So this is Brother Charles. And I thought it would be good for us to use this as a closing prayer to sum up our thinking today. This, of course, Charles, is prayer to God to create in us a heart which is not deceived, but rather open to the grace that God has for us. So we'll spend just a moment of quiet, then I'll read these words as our prayer to end our session together. Oh, for a heart to praise my God, a heart from sin set free, a heart that's sprinkled with the blood so freely shed for me. Thy nature, gracious Lord, impart. Come quickly from above. Write thy new name upon my heart, thy new best name of love.
Amen.
Amen.
And may the grace and peace of God, Father, Son, and Spirit be with us all this day and always. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.